Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here with us tonight for the One Book, One Boulder conversation on So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. My name is Julianne, and we're here with Boulder City Council members Junie Joseph and Mary Young, and musician, activist, and our facilitator for the evening, Stefan Brackett. We are broadcasting live, mostly from Boulder, and in Stefan's case, I think out of Denver.
Yep.
Feel free to let us know where you're viewing from in the chat. Before I pass the mics over to you all, we'd like to thank the Boulder Library Foundation for their generous support making the One Book, One Boulder series and many of our other library events possible. Our Q&A tonight will take place toward the end of our event, but feel free to submit your questions during the conversation. We have some discussion guidelines regarding the chat that I'd like to share with everyone. We'd like to listen to and amplify marginalized voices. So if you choose to self-identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, we invite you to put an asterisk before your questions and comments so that way we can be sure to give marginalized voices a chance to speak and be heard. Number 2, we want to hold space and give grace. So to the best of your ability, we encourage you to ask questions that will lead to your own greater understanding, while also making sure to leave space for others to speak, share, and understand. Ask yourself if you're stereotyping, underestimating, or insulting a fellow community member. When listening to others, let's give grace. We all stumble and make mistakes as we grow. And our last guideline is no racist statements in the chat will be tolerated. Please join me in welcoming our guests, Junie Joseph, Mary Young, and Stefan Brackett.
Thank you so much, Julianne. Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Mary and Junie. I just want to get started, if that's okay with y'all. It's not lost on anybody. Actually, as a matter of fact, I've been trying to change my practice because I feel like when you ask somebody how they're doing, especially in America, people are just like, "Oh, I'm good," and it's like, actually, I'm not sure anybody is good right now. I think we might be good in spite of, but we haven't had much of an opportunity to really got to conversationally even unpack anything. So with that, I just want to kind of start with an opening question that kind of speaks to the weight of this moment. So just going to ask you both, and whichever one of you wants to answer first. What is weighing on you? What weight are you carrying with you in this moment? What has been heavy?
Junie, go first.
You just got voluntold. Okay, I see how this is.
I'm happy to do it.
Sure. I think, right now with the pandemic and everything that's happening in the world, of course, I think, safety of community members is something that is very important to us. We're constantly thinking, I think it probably is the same for Mary as well, constantly thinking on what I can do to make Boulder better or safer for all community members, but also listening to people, right? Because, again, I stay constant with my email to responding to community members. So I think to me is being not skipping a beat, if that makes sense, ensuring that I communicate with people, but also as a human beings, I have brothers, ensuring that they're safe. My mom and my grandmother. So it's like family and also community. These two things are, things that are, I would say, that weigh heavily at this moment because of the pandemic.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Julie. And how about you, Mary?
This is my 7th year on council, and it's by far has been the most, it's been extraordinarily challenging and difficult for all the reasons that Junie mentioned. And so it's always difficult. It's always been a difficult challenge to be on council because there's so many competing voices and challenges, and all the problems seem to be wicked. But this moment presents itself in a way that it's highlighted all of these disparities, and my, as like Junie said, I'm really challenged to think of ways in which I can use this moment and my position to do something about those disparities in whatever way that I can, and that's kind of been my focus, is to focus on the people that are experiencing this moment, and are bearing the brunt of the pandemic. So what can you do as a city council member? It's a little frustrating because you can do some and make sure that the city is putting its resources in the right place. But it's very frustrating because the best action needs to come from our federal government, and it isn't. So it's difficult. It's a difficult moment in time.
Well, I would just like to thank you both for saying that, and just thank you both for willingly being civil servants who are holding that tension, who are listening to that choir of voices, and trying to pick out priorities that will serve us most in the future, which is no easy task. And I think it's kind of representative of y'all's alignment, that you're taking time to do things like this, that you're taking time to have conversations about race, and a point in time where the country's embroiled in not conversations, but arguments and screaming matches about this. And so just thank you all for like just being a part of this. And so Mary, you said something about listening to a plurality of voices and trying to do things around disparities. And what that brings to mind from the book is just the topic of intersectionality. Now, I do want to kind of avoid jargon, because I think it's really easy to like throw out these big words and then not really define it. So we allow a lot of people to rest in the ambiguities. So with that, I'm just wondering if both of y'all would kind of give, like, what does intersectionality mean to you? And why is it important to address when we're discussing race?
You want to go again first, Mary?
No, I think Mary's going to go first this time.
I'll go first this time, for sure. What does intersectionality mean to me? It is a way of recognizing that that disadvantages compound each other, and it's not so much to create. You always hear among conversations with folks about when you're speaking with, a Latino person is speaking with a Black person, speaking about Asians, and then it's like everybody has the oppression Olympics, right? And it's not so much about establishing a hierarchy of oppressions, rather than recognizing that disadvantages compound, and how, by recognizing that, how can we create a more equitable society?
Absolutely. So, and in the compounding, we're kind of saying like all the different layers of a person's identity, right, can be an advantage or a disadvantage. And in particular with intersectionality, we're kind of talking about the different ways that lack of privilege intersects and changes the entire, like, will change how we deal with or have conversations with and create innovations around justice. Junie, how about for you?
Yeah, thank you. I studied human rights, and then I also have a minor in anthropology. So culture has always been something that fascinates me. learning about people. And, I studied a little bit about intersectionality when I was in college at university. And even today, before I got here, and I was like, I need to get the proper definition. I make sure I got that from the dictionary. But I think it goes back to what you say, not get stuck in the jargon, and also what Mary just talked about. Intersectionality is really acknowledging that we are complex human beings, right? And we walk into the world, each one of us, with different advantages and disadvantages, as you mentioned, and we have to recognize these things. And not only that, if we remember when Kimberly Crenshaw actually coined that term, there was a case, I believe, that was going through the US courts at the time. And a Black woman or a group of Black women were going through the system, and the court did not understand what it means to what disadvantages that Black women themselves faced. So the thing is, even though I'm a Black woman, for instance, I'm Black, I'm Haitian, I have an accent. So it goes back to the compounding effect of what it means to be Junie, really. And again, as people who are working in government, it's very important that we recognize these things so that we can better implement policies, because you know how sometimes we can have broad brushes and say, oh yeah, this policy will work for, this population. But even within the population that we serve, even in certain subcultures, there are often people within that subculture who are marginalized. So I think that's the thing that intersectionality help us to recognize, that even within discrimination, there are compounding discriminations. It's really interesting and fascinating to learn. And also it makes it a lot more complex to solve some of the issues that we face.
Absolutely. But then what are some of the advantages? Because and in the book it's covered that some people will critique and say that intersectionality slows down processes. Or the lens of intersectionality. What do you think are some net positives from this kind of lens or this kind of work?
I mean, of course, the positive is that you're aware, right? It is very important to be aware, because at the end of the day, if you are a policymaker and you just think of broad brushing, okay, this will work for all men, and you don't understand that Black men walk into the world differently. They experience the world differently. And not only that, they experience it, but also the way people treat them are different. So you have to you have to think differently. You have to be more creative. And that requires, I think, the advantages of recognizing that, which I've talked about, and I think, which is very, since I've been on council, I recognize this is part of Mary's work, actually. Just when I got on council, she's constantly thinking of equity. We're working on equity all the time. Why? Because we know that the work that we do impact people differently. But imagine if she didn't know that. Imagine if I didn't recognize that as well. So we would just go about the world with rosy glasses thinking that, yeah, we're doing great work, but we were not really doing the work that could really help certain people in the community. So intersectionality is the advantages of that. It helps you fine tune the work that you do, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it does help fine tune the work. And we hear that word equity a lot these days. And it's sometimes, and Junie has heard me say this before, because we serve on the subcommittee for the Government Alliance on Racial Equity on Council. And I hear it thrown around a lot. And it's kind of like intersectionality. Folks think they know what it is and they know how to accomplish it, but actually accomplishing equity is really hard. And it's not, I shouldn't say it's really hard. I think in some instances it's clear what needs to be done, in other instances not so easy. But you can't be favoring one side over another. You have to provide equity in a way that that is fair, but doesn't compound disadvantages, and creates pathways for people and creates access. I always think about access, about in the work, being on council.
Yeah.
And to me, you asked about our identities, and Junie mentioned she's Haitian, she's Black, she's a woman. And one of my identities is that I'm a Spanish speaker. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about access and how to use that advantage, because I see that as an advantage, especially serving on council, how can I use that to provide access to people? I don't, it's not so much that I want to do things for someone. I want to provide the access so that people can then do things for themselves. Yes. And ultimately, because if you don't, I will be off of council someday. And if what you're doing is always doing for someone and not providing them the access and the vehicle and the knowledge, when you go, that connection is gone. Mm. So using my ability to speak Spanish and reaching out to the Spanish-speaking community, and also I'm bicultural, and Junie can probably understand how you code switch, and you go to your, I go to my Mexican culture, and being able to speak Spanish and have that cultural piece, you can make those connections. It makes making those connections easier. Mm. And so it's part of it to me is don't forget where you come from. Mm. Because and that forms part of my identity. I may have a lot of privilege now, and I do see myself having a lot of privilege, but it wasn't always that way. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important in the work on council that you don't forget that.
Wow. Yes, absolutely. And you all just both said so much, and it's just kind of like already started into like one of the questions, but I just want to lead into it because like in this, when we're talking about identities, when we're talking about like being true to where you came from, so much about identity is assumption, right? Like 99% is people assuming things about us, and then like that remaining 1% are conversations we actually have people that we're in with, people that we have relationships with. So like just in this, in the interest of intersectionality and being able to like remember who you came from, and then also be able to declare who you are. Which intersectionalities do you identify with that you want to declare as your own in this moment? So not necessarily like, here's the exhaustive thing. It's like, no, like this is who I am declaring at this moment, because I just don't think there's many opportunities for people to actually do so, especially for public figures as yourselves. I think a lot of times like people have an idea of you, and just like in this moment, who do you declare?
Yeah. I can start. I think for me, I think my faith has helped me a lot in life. So I identify a lot as a Christian, and I've worked in really hardship areas around the world, and I think because of that, that has helped me. It has guided me. There's nothing greater than faith when you're seeing the worst of people in the world or around the world. So that has helped me. But also, I think I'm really anchored in the idea that I'm human. I that's how I connect with a lot of people, because there's so many things that separate all of us, right? There's, again, I'm Black, I'm Haitian, I'm a woman, I have an accent. So all these things as well can seem to separate us as well, right? Because the thing is, being Black, I can't hide that. Mm-hmm. Being a woman, you can't hide that. So to me, I'm anchored in the fact that I'm a human being, and also the fact that I'm a Christian. But of course, when I ran for council, because sometimes as well, again, I think it goes back to what you said, how does intersectionality help us? Mm-hmm. When I ran for council, I ran as a student. I
Mm.
ran as a working class woman.
Yes. Hmm.
So all these things were intersectionalities, a part of who I am. I used these things at the time when I was running, but every day when I wake up, that's not what defines me.
Hmm.
That's not what drives me in the morning. What drives me in the morning and give me passion is the fact that I'm a human being and I'm a Christian woman.
Hmm.
So these things are, you see what I mean? So I
Yes.
connect with people with certain part of my intersectionality, but within my core, my humanity is what I really identify with.
And thank you for that, because when else do we get to say those things? I think it's very often that we will use different shorthands that are adjusted for different audiences. Um, but it's not that often that we get to just like say, well, yeah, and this is when I wake up in the morning, this is how I'm waking up as, and this is what gives me power. And how about for you, Mary?
Wow. Um, it's it's interesting because we are different people in different contexts,
Yes.
and I identify probably most as a Mexican American in this moment, and that's because of where I grew up, and there was no such thing as a Latina, and that's kind of a new thing to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think being Mexican American, um, and being on council certainly makes up part of my identity right now. Um, and to Junie's counterpoint to Junie's Christian faith, I'm a recovering Catholic, so it's quite. I grew up Catholic, and I think that still influences me to this day. I have a rosary, and I have a lot of Virgen de Guadalupes all over the house. I have them all over the house, and it's just it's something that reminds me of where I came from and
Mm.
who I am. And I think when I'm home, I do see that part of me. And when I go out in the world in Boulder, it's I have to be the city council member, and so it's different things in different contexts. The older I've gotten, I also have come to identify more with my indigenous roots,
Mm-hmm.
and so things change in context and in time.
Mm. And something that I'm hearing from you all, and I just want to add this to the conversation. I want to see what you all think of this. Is that at this point in time when we're talking about intersectionality, we are talking about lack of privilege. But I think once we ultimately, when we actually are really having conversations around intersectionality and we're figuring out ways to include everybody, I think that those same things will become strengths. Or because they exist as lack of privilege does not mean that that's the story for everyone experiencing it. Like Junie, from what I've heard, like you being a black woman, while it is an intersectionality of lack of privilege, is also a source of power. The same for you being a Mexican American person, Mary. Like there's a source of strength and knowing from where you are. Like for me, waking up as a black man is a source of strength and power for me. So I just don't think that necessarily, even though we're talking about things that are in relationship with oppression, there's also still a deeper story as well about what these things can mean for other people. Would you say that's true?
I think that's true, and I would add that um, because of what all of us go through hardships,
Mm-hmm.
some more than others, but I think that um, it also makes us more resilient,
Mm.
and communities that have seen the most hardship are actually the most resilient, and can deal with more adversity. Doesn't mean that they should have to, but because they have had to, they have strengthened that muscle. And I think that's something that that we can all learn from.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Go ahead, please.
Good. Sorry.
No?
No, I think what Mary said resonates with me because, you know, when we talk about oppression, you know, it's sometimes the way we talk about it, right? There is that discourse that needs to happen. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we don't disempower the community that we're talking about, because we're all human beings and we have agency. And I think it goes back to, you know, Mary mentioned community, and it brings something just like my antenna went up, because again, with this idea of community, this idea of being Black, there is a lot of power in it. Because think about it, there is a community of Black people. In Black culture, there are a lot of beautiful things, just like there are a lot of beautiful things with white culture, with Mexican culture. So all these things that people often talk about within this idea of oppression, there are a lot of beautiful things that are attached to them. With my Haitian culture, there's the language, there's the food. And if I take you to a Haitian community in Miami, you would see things that you probably don't get to see other places. And I would imagine it's the same thing for Mary if she takes you some places around the United States or even in Mexico. So I think we also have to recognize that people have agency when we talk about this idea of oppression. And, you know, if there's one thing I can say, you know, I'm not my oppression. You know what I mean? There's so much more to me as an individual. I walk into this world as an individual, not just as a Black person. Being Black is part of my identity, but it is not everything. And the oppressive part of it is not the whole picture. So I don't go around thinking, oh yeah, I'm Black and I'm oppressed, and you know what I mean? It's not that way. There's more to it. Of course, do I face challenges as a Black woman? Of course, you know, but at the same time, there's a rich human being who has much more to offer to the world than just this idea of oppression.
And the more that we are able to practice intersectionality, then the more we have agency in lifting the oppression for other people, right? Because I think the other beautiful thing about intersectionality is that we get to see all the different roles in which we play. Just because I am Black does not mean that I do not participate in male privilege. And because I am a Black man, that does not mean that that doesn't excuse me from being trained in misogyny. Like, so intersectionality is like, oh, I can actually do something about that in the way that I deal with people. So thank you all so much for this. And then, so I'm going to move to the next question. Like, we're talking about intersectionality, what it means, like who we are. But then you both talked about the identity of being a city council person. So in that position as council members, what you spoke a little bit about it, like, but what privileges and advantages have you used in order to be a voice for the people in Boulder? So as local leaders, how does the concept of intersectionality help you listen to people whose lives may be drastically different from yours?
You know, I'll give you an example of something that occurred. I guess it was maybe now 2 years ago on council, and I got a call from someone who knew someone, that kind of thing, yeah. And they were advocating for a person who lives in this community out just on the other side of 28th Street, and a community that's kind of tucked in, and some people don't even know it's there. But they were having issues with their cars getting towed. And this community is quite diverse, but it's mostly Latinos and people that mostly speak Spanish. But there's a lot of diversity within the community. And so I thought, well, gee, I can go there and I can find out and talk to the people because I can speak the language.
Yeah.
And so I did. And one thing led to another. And fast forward 2 years later, they have formed a resident organization for this community themselves. They're advocating for themselves. And tomorrow they're going to be painting a mural on 34th Street together. And so and I think it's an important point to make is that, again, and I will make it again, and it's not about so much about helping people, but providing people with the access. And I can't stress enough how important the access is, because a lot of people in Boulder know how to advocate for themselves, and how to access counsel. But it's important to provide that access and the vehicles by which people can advocate for themselves, because ultimately that's how they gain power.
Yeah. I think the question you ask is, how have we used intersectionality within our role, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Again, as I mentioned to you, when I ran for council, I mean, we already had Mary on city council as, a rock star and a woman of color. And Boulder had women of color before on city council. But I ran for council because of the fact, again, housing was a big issue for me, and being a student, and I felt that the voice of students were not being heard. And again, that's a section of the community. And as a council member, I still speak on behalf of students as well. When we have conversation, whether it's during council meeting or even in our subcommittees, I bring forward the views of students and working class people. But our council is very, I am fortunate, right, that, I feel a lot of our council members are quite aware of intersectionality and equity issues, and we have those discussions. And I think it goes back to what Mary said. At the end of the day, we're not speaking directly for people, because again, that's something that I say, as a Black woman, I am a law student. And I understand my privileges as well, right? Because again, we're human beings, we are multifaceted, we are not one thing. And I know that as a law student, my life experiences doesn't really reflect 100% the voices of the people who I represent. Because if you really think about it, I represent students at CU, and I ran on that platform that I want to represent the students. But there are some students that are 21, 22 years old who are not open to speaking out and let their voices be heard, or who have financial issues, or who have different kind of issues. So I always put the caveat, yes, I want to speak on behalf of students, but I understand my privilege and where I stand in the world. And even when I try to nuance what I say, sometimes I will miss out. Because yes, for instance, I mentioned the last time we had a chat, Stephen, that, there are women who have working 2 jobs, who have kids, and I don't have any of these things. And I can't say for sure 100% that I fully understand where they come from. But with my level of empathy and also the level of interaction and communication that I have with people in the community, which I did before the pandemic hit, going out there and going to the different working class communities, knocking on doors and finding out what people are what's their desires, what do they want in this community, which I believe Mary has done a lot of as well. And then you bring these things back to council. So in my work to reflect, like you said, some the intersectionalities that I see around the community, it's basically being a vehicle, it's being a medium, but not necessarily stand in the shoes of the person. And I think that's the worst thing anybody can do, is just stand in people's shoes. You don't want to do that. You want to bring them along in the discussion, as opposed to just say, I represent all Black people, I represent all, Asian. It's just not necessarily the case, right?
Yeah, that's like, you don't represent all Black women law students in Colorado.
All Black
Mary,
Haitian.
and Mary, you don't represent all the women in the state with fabulous necklaces. That's not like an official. Okay, all right. I'll make sure to make a note. So, but with that, what I'm hearing is like there's incredible tools in the work that y'all are doing centered around humility, like the humility of knowing that you're not the voice for the people. You're just trying to stand as a conduit. And then I also hear like the incredible power of empathy. So the question I want to ask, Mary, you talked about access. In a point in time where the country is so embroiled in racial shouting matches, what kind of access do you think would be most useful to change things? What kind of access do we need to have better race conversations or to speak into this situation?
Well, access to ourselves.
Mm.
Because I think that that's where it begins. It begins within each and every one of us to understand how the structural and institutional racism lives within each of us, and and once you start that exploration within yourself, once you start, you can't stop, and you start to see things in yourself that I find shocking sometimes, and it's like, whoa, where did that come from? And I think that that's what we need. We need to, all of us need to recognize that that's where it starts. It's a personal journey, and it has to begin with being open to the possibility that you may not like what you see in yourself. But that's where it starts, because until you recognize that, you can't see it in the systems. And the more I learn, and I don't know that much, but you just see things every day in some sort of a policy or a program, or it's just everywhere. But I don't think that it's possible to begin to see it without first spending time with yourself and doing some self-reflection. And and it requires a lot of reading, which can be hard to do when you're on council and when you're a law student.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, can you remind me of the question again? Sorry.
Oh, no, absolutely. It was just kind of with Mary's talking about how like what y'all are pretty much doing is not you're not bringing fish to people, you're teaching them to fish, or like you're showing them the pathway to the fishing hole, like you're creating access. And just like, what kind of access do you think is required to speak into this racially charged moment? What is access? What would be a kind of solution around that?
Access, as in, because when you first mentioned access, I was thinking policy. What type of policy do we need to bring forward? But I think you're asking something more.
I'm asking something intentionally vague, letting you come up with any kind of answer that you want to. So policy.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Mary said. This idea of change start with us, right? We understand there are structural issues that we're dealing with. But I think, again, this is a conversation that we're having, and that's a conversation we have open to the community, and we want people to partake and give their feedback. And I think people have to understand that one thing I notice on social media, right, is that people are there are a lot of emotionally charged discussion, and people, and I think, it's a space where people could be constructive and be more open, and you know what I mean? They could use it for positive, but because they are so quick to be aroused and be so emotional and be so charged, that they miss that opportunity. So I think, like you said, if we're trying to solve problems, we have to give each other space. And we have to walk into that space with intention, right? If you want to change things and you want to make the world a better place, you can't start with insulting the person, whoever he or she may be, which happen quite often in social media. People will just start, you are racist, you're the worst human being. Starting a conversation that way is not going to get us anywhere. Because we're human beings. We're human first. And I think that's the thing. Even though I'm a city council person, I'm a human being first. And I think that empathy is very important in order to have that open discussion. So let's start there. Let's start with you being human, being kind with one another, and approach each other with space, knowing that, this country, the way it was founded and what people believed back then, it's going to take time for someone to change. Give them that space and gently lead them and help them get across. And I know there are people who said, why should we do that? We need to just punch people into doing the right thing. But that's not going to work. It hasn't worked. It will not work. So you have to be compassionate as well. If you're asking someone to change, how about you change as well? You change first. Show them the difference you want to see in the world.
Absolutely. Well, y'all are preaching. One of the things
the book said no preaching, by the way. The book
yes,
is not supposed to be.
You're right. I'm sorry. But one of the things that I loved about this book that speaks a little bit to what y'all were talking about is I feel like Ijeoma did not spare the critique on herself. Like she also within the book is talking about ways in which she failed, ways in which she started following a single story, ways in which she was not intersectional, the ways in which she was kind of turning a blind eye to her privileges and such. So I love that what both of y'all are saying is also kind of talking about all of us are participating in this, and all the things that are kind of messed up about the system, we've also been taught. So it's going to take individual deliberation in some ways to kind of figure out in which ways that has warped us. But then also and we're about to get ready for questions from people, but right before as folks are kind of getting their questions ready, I want to kind of ask y'all, I think it totally makes sense for me. And I think this book and this whole process is about doing some individual interior work. But then also, I think one of the challenges is, as Junie, as you said, we don't solve anything by punching folks. But I think a lot of times when people go interior, they're beating themselves all up. Just the guilt, the shame. I think that there's a very real human reaction when you find out that you may have hurt someone and you didn't know. How that journey within, especially in this context, especially with social media, is not necessarily a gentle one. What are ways that you all think that we can navigate the challenge of this and the deep challenge of doing individual change?
I mean, for me, I can start, Mary. I mean, it goes back for me. It goes back to my faith and the fact that we're leaders in the community. That's different. Or interaction with people is grounded in the fact that we can't react the same way that they do, right? Mm-hmm. So, but deeper and deeper is, to me, is the fact that it goes back to the fact that I mentioned earlier, I'm a Christian, and also, every day I try to be a little bit more empathetic in the way I see people and what's going on in their world and why they react the way that they do, right? Of course, we're human beings. Sometimes someone will say something to us and it might throw me off, right? Mm-hmm. But, I think, again, that level of compassion and empathy, you have to work on it. We all have to work on it. You know what I mean? Because I don't think we can truly change the world. I mean, if you even look around the world, people say, yeah, revolution just changed things. Yes, sometimes it changed things for the better, but a lot of times when you look around the world as well, a lot of revolutions actually throw a lot of countries in chaos, if you really look at it. So I think we have to then, give ourselves that space so that we can be constructive in the way that we react, in the decisions that we make, so that we know that, okay, the world I'm creating is not just a chaotic world, it's really a better world. Because you can start with this idea, I want to make the world better, but you just go at it in a way that is not really constructive and helpful, and it creates more chaos. So I think there is a level of responsibility and accountability that we have to take as human beings.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree, Junie. And, you mentioned being on council. I think one of the things that we started out with the challenge of this moment. And the challenge of this moment is people come to council wanting things done their way. And that, and the way that we're going to make the world a better place isn't by doing things one way, the way a certain group wants it done. We're going to have to compromise. And I know that can be a dirty word in some with some folks, but it really is. I mean, it really is about finding middle grounds. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges on council, is that people want things done their way, but the trick of governance is to find something that will work for the whole community. And that generates the emotions on social media that Junie's talking about. So it's, but I still maintain that the journey starts within ourselves. And I'm reading a book right now that whose thesis is that we all have historical trauma. We're all dealing with historical trauma, and that understanding how to heal that historical trauma within each of us is a necessary ingredient to overcoming all of the racial strife that we have in this country and the world, for that matter.
Stephen, can I add something?
Yes, of course.
I just what Mary just said is, I love talking with Mary because she makes me think. I think part of it, I just wanted to add, being a council member and being a human being, just being human, is that we don't want to recreate inequalities, right? And I think it's very important. And I think that's what that accountability comes in, that responsibility to know that, yes, I understand that I experience inequality in the world, and I want to make the world a better place for me and my children, but also for my neighbors' children, also for everyone else in the community. So it's not just me going about the world just so intensely focused on just one thing that somehow, no matter how it impacts other people, it really doesn't matter because it's just about getting my way. No, but the world doesn't work that way. That's how we are where we are today. Because back when the first group of Black people were coming to this country on a slave ship, people were not considering that these were human beings, that their feelings matter, that, you see what I mean? Yeah. So now we are trying to build a better world. So we need to go at it in a more crafty and a more humane way. We can't just want what we want without considering our neighbors.
Absolutely. And actually, there's been so much beautiful stuff. We're about to go into people giving their questions. We're about to read those. And then also Mary, what was the name of that book? It sounds fascinating if you can recall.
My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem.
Ooh, My Grandmother's Hands. Okay, I'm gonna have to check that out. And then Junie, I think that's a beautiful way for us to kind of close this whole section, that kind of idea. Bring it back to intersectionality. Practice well, we become experts in advocating for stories other than our own. And if we're able to start doing that, we will start seeing more equity, more justice. We'll have less paralysis. We'll have less questions about how we can help. But yeah, I think it's a very it's a basic idea that needs to be just like talked about more. It's like, how do I rep other people's stories and know them? Yeah, well, one of my mentors, Rick Griffin, he was just like, he's like, as a black man, it's my job to get up on stage and say I'm a raging feminist. Like, it's like, and like, we need to be able to choose like other folks that we are also fighting for, and that just raises all ships. So now, thank you all so much. We're going to get into some of the questions from folks with the remaining 10 minutes that we have. And so the first question, and please, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Luis Fuki Garrels has the question: if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing in the area of racial justice in Boulder, what would you change? Thank you, Luis.
Well, that's a good question, because it's not any one thing that would create racial justice in Boulder. But again, I keep coming back to I would change myself.
Yeah, I think again, when we talk about inequalities and racial justice, it's not one thing, right? I think, even when we talked about intersectionality earlier, it's this idea that it's compounding, it's multifaceted. Changing one thing is not really going to solve everything. And I think that's why we have those complex discussions, right? So I don't have an answer for that, because there's not one answer. It's much more dynamic, much more complex.
All right.
Agree.
Nice. Very good way to answer that question. All right. So John Somerville, if I'm getting that right, what are some positive ways of addressing intersectionality, whether it's the admission of privilege or lack thereof in the workplace?
I mean, I can start. I think part of it, again, I like the fact that you mentioned acknowledging is great, addressing. And I think the addressing part is making space and giving room, right? Making space for people to express themselves and share with you their stories. I think that's very important in addressing intersectionality, because again, because of the compounding effect of it, or you may not fully understand, you may not know how to go about changing things. Again, it goes back to communication is so important, making space for people to come in and communicate with you.
How about for you, Mary?
Well, right here on page 80, she gives a list of things,
yes,
actually.
I was just looking at the same thing. Yes.
Right here on page 80, it's all right there. But I think one of the things that needs to be recognized, and probably the thing that resonated the most with me when I read this, was what she wrote about how when you address intersectionality, it's going to take more time. And a perfect example of that is voting rights, the suffragette movement, right? I mean, yes, women obtained the right to vote in 1920, but intersectionality prevented Black women from voting for another almost 50 years, as Junie said on the night that we read the Declaration. So it doesn't have to take that much time, but it does, because when you're looking out for the voices of those that don't have access, you have to try harder.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. And so from Marcus Popetz, on the topic of inclusivity, has anyone tried to create a list of all the different segments of Boulder to consider when they're trying to improve inclusivity? I suspect. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I suspect that Marcus might be like you, Mary, and have like an engineering background. That feels like
making lists.
Yeah.
Checking them off. I think that's important.
I think we do, Mary. I mean, as part of the GARE, I think we do, during our equity work, we do talk about equity, and in the different subcommittees, and even during city council meetings, we always consider whether, oh yeah, how is this impacting different communities, whether it's the working class or students. I mean, we don't have a checklist like this during the meetings, but we do talk about all these different groups and subgroups around the community.
Yeah. Certainly, yeah. So I think certainly that needs to be thought of, and you're right, Junie. I think that the closest thing that we have to a list is in the council resolution that we passed last December on racial equity. There is in there a set of actions, and it would be cool. There it is, 1275, passed late 2019, and a link. That's probably the closest to a list that we have in actions that the council will take to further racial justice.
Well, thank you all so much. We're coming towards the end of our time. Is there a parting word that you would love to kind of leave the group with as we're wrapping up?
I mean, for me, I think this is a great conversation. I appreciate this community because it gives us that space to have difficult and challenging discussions about race. Certainly, I don't think this issue is going to go away anytime soon, and we need to continue having this conversation. But I think it speaks to our resiliency as human beings, as people, and the fact that we're thriving to make our community better by having these conversations.
Yeah, I agree. I think these conversations are important, and and I want to give a shout out to our library and library staff and director and to you, Stephen, for helping pull this off and bringing it together. This is an important step, and I hope that these conversations and this kind of forum continues. I do hope so. And I'll put in one more plug for Change Starts within each of us.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you for everybody in Boulder who's been participating in this and starting that journey of interior change. Every bit does help, and especially if we're all trying to, with humility and compassion, trying to provide access to our interiors to really bring about change to the exterior. So thank you all so much. Keep being kind, keep being compassionate, and realize that all strength shows itself in kindness. So let's be strong together.
Thanks, y'all. I had a couple of items just to cover really quick for our viewers. So yes, on behalf of Boulder Public Library and the Boulder Library Foundation, thank you, Junie, thank you, Mary, and thank you, Stefan. Viewers, we'd also like to keep this conversation going. Thank you for joining us. A survey link is going to be shared in the chat, so please share your experience of One Book, One Boulder with us. Like and subscribe for more content from the Boulder Public Library. There are many more One Book, One Boulder events for all ages coming your way, and those can be found at boulderlibrary.org/onebook. I'll throw that up on the screen in a second. And just to let y'all know, registration is now open for our author event on November 5th with Ijeoma Oluo. Information can be found at the link below. Here we go. Thanks, everybody. I hope y'all have a good night, and we'll see you next time.